moment most people misunderstand what happens when an empath finally stops caring. They assume it's anger, they assume it's bitterness, revenge, or emotional coldness. But in reality, it's usually none of those things. The truth is far more psychological than emotional. An empath does not stop caring because they suddenly lose compassion. They stop caring because their nervous system can no longer survive the imbalance. And that distinction matters. Empaths are often conditioned from an early age to become emotional monitors. They learn to read tone, facial expressions, tension, silence, mood shifts. Not because they're weak, but because somewhere in their development, emotional awareness became tied to safety. They became experts at anticipating needs, calming conflict, and maintaining emotional equilibrium for everyone around them. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern. Their identity slowly becomes connected to how useful they are to other people emotionally. That's why empaths tend to stay too long in one-sided relationships. They mistake emotional labor for love. They confuse understanding someone with being responsible for them. And the more emotionally intelligent they are, easier it becomes for toxic people to justify their behavior around them. Because the empath can always see the pain underneath. They can always explain the trauma, the insecurity, the fear driving someone's actions, but eventually something changes. The empath begins to notice a pattern. No matter how much patience they offer, the disrespect continues. No matter how calmly they communicate, the manipulation adapts. No matter how much empathy they give, it is consumed without reciprocity. And this is the moment most people never see coming. The empath realizes they are not in a relationship built on connection. They are trapped in a system built on emotional extraction. Psychologically, this creates cognitive dissonance. The empath's mind keeps saying, if I love harder, maybe this improves. But their body tells a different story. Exhaustion, anxiety, emotional numbness, hypervigilance, chronic overthinking. Their nervous system starts sounding an alarm long before their conscious mind accepts the truth. And when that realization finally lands, it changes everything. Because once an empath sees the dynamic clearly, they can no longer unsee it. The illusion breaks. They stop. They're romanticizing potential. They stop negotiating with disrespect. They stop trying to heal people who are committed to remaining destructive. And perhaps most importantly, they stop explaining themselves to people who only listened in order to gain emotional leverage. This is why the empath's detachment often shocks people. It appears sudden from the outside, but internally, it was a slow psychological death followed by a quiet rebirth. By the time the empath emotionally disconnects, they've usually spent months, sometimes years, trying every possible way to preserve the connection. So when they finally let go, there's often no dramatic explosion left, just silence, just distance, just absence. And that silence unsettles people, especially toxic individuals. Because many manipulative personalities rely on emotional access. They rely on reactions, guilt, emotional negotiations, and predictability. They are comfortable when the empath is still trying to explain, defend, or repair. But the moment the empath becomes emotionally neutral, the entire power structure collapses. The manipulator no longer feels in control because the empath is no longer emotionally hooked into the cycle. C is the part people rarely talk about. An empath's final stage is not hatred, it's indifference. And psychologically, indifference is far more powerful than anger because it signals emotional freedom. Anger still creates attachment. Indifference ends the transaction completely. The empath finally understands something most people learn too late. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And once they realize that, they begin reclaiming the energy they once wasted trying to save people committed to misunderstanding them. The moment an empath stops caring is not the moment they become heartless. It's the moment they stop abandoning themselves. One of the most misunderstood forms of power is silence. Most people think power is dominance, persuasion, emotional intensity, or the ability to win arguments. But psychologically, real power often reveals itself in restraint, in what a person chooses not to say. And when an empath finally reaches the point where they stop caring in the old way, silence becomes their most dangerous tool, not because they are trying to manipulate anyone, but because they no longer feel the need to manage everyone else's emotional reality. That's a massive shift. Empaths are often trapped in a cycle of over-explaining themselves. They explain their intentions, explain their boundaries, explain why something hurt them, explain why they reacted the way they did. And they do this because they assume clarity creates connection. They believe that if they can just communicate well enough, honestly enough, calmly enough, the other person will eventually understand. But toxic dynamics don't fail because of a lack of communication. They fail because one person benefits from misunderstanding the other. That realization changes the empath completely, because eventually they begin to notice something disturbing. The more they explain, the more ammunition they provide. Every emotional confession becomes data. Every vulnerable conversation becomes material for future manipulation. Toxic people study reactions the way strategists study patterns. They learn what triggers guilt, what creates self-doubt, what pulls the empath back into emotional labor. And once the empath recognizes this pattern, silence stops feeling passive. It becomes protective. This is where emotional intelligence evolves into emotional discipline. The empath number no longer rushes to defend themselves against false narratives. They no longer interrupt their peace to correct every misunderstanding. They stop chasing closure from people who were never interested in truth to begin with. And psychologically, this creates enormous discomfort in those who once relied on the empath's emotional availability. Because silence removes access. It removes predictability. It removes control. It removes the emotional feedback loop toxic individuals depend on. Most manipulative people are not actually seeking resolution. They are seeking engagement. As long as they can provoke a reaction, they still feel psychologically connected to the person. Even anger gives them reassurance. Even conflict gives them relevance. But silence creates ambiguity, and the human mind struggles with ambiguity more than rejection. When the empath stops reacting, the manipulator loses the map. Suddenly, the usual tactics stop working. Guilt no longer works. Provocation no longer works. Emotional games no longer work. And this is why silence often triggers stronger reactions than confrontation ever did. People become disturbed when they can no longer read you, especially if they built their sense of control around your emotional transparency. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Silence is the moment the empath stops outsourcing self-worth. They no longer need immediate validation, immediate understanding, or immediate resolution. They become comfortable letting people misunderstand them if explaining themselves requires self-betrayal. That is emotional maturity. Because not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every conflict deserves your energy. And not every person deserves access to your inner world. A highly self-aware empath eventually understands that attention is currency. Emotional energy is currency. Time is currency, and constantly giving those resources to destructive people is a form of unconscious self-abandonment. So they become quieter, not colder, not crueler, just more intentional. They observe more. They speak less. They stop trying to rescue every relationship from collapse. And ironically, this is often the phase where they become the most psychologically intimidating. Because calmness in someone who used to overextend themselves signals transformation. It signals that the emotional dependency has been broken. And once that dependency disappears, the entire dynamic changes. The empath no longer fears losing people who only valued access to their energy. They no longer panic at distance, silence, or withdrawal from others because they have learned how to emotionally anchor themselves. Their peace is no longer negotiable. That's why silence becomes power. Not because silence controls other people, but because it reflects control over oneself. And the moment a person no longer needs to react to prove their worth, they become impossible to manipulate. What surprises most empaths is that after they finally stop caring in the unhealthy way, they don't become empty. They become clear. That's the transformation nobody warns you about. Because for most of their lives, empaths have been trained to believe their value comes from emotional availability, from being needed, from being the calm one, the understanding one, the emotionally flexible one. So naturally, they assume that if they stop carrying everyone else emotionally, they'll lose a part of themselves. But the opposite happens. They begin recovering parts of themselves they never realized they sacrificed. At first, the change feels familiar. There's guilt. There's discomfort. The nervous system almost panics in the absence of emotional chaos because chaos had become psychologically familiar. This is why many empaths unconsciously return to toxic environments. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because unpredictability became normalized. Their minds learn to associate emotional struggle with connection. And when that cycle finally breaks, silence can initially feel lonely. But then something remarkable begins to happen. Mental clarity returns, The empath starts waking up without immediately thinking about everyone else's emotions. They stop replaying conversations for hours trying to figure out how to keep the peace. Their body relaxes. Their thinking sharpens. They begin noticing how much energy was being consumed by emotional survival rather than actual living. This is where the transformation becomes visible, because when an empath redirects their energy inward instead of constantly projecting it outward, their perception changes completely. They start seeing patterns they once ignored. Manipulation becomes easier to detect. Passive aggression becomes obvious. Empty charm becomes transparent. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or attention with respect. And psychologically, this happens because they are no longer filtering reality through desperation for connection. That's an important distinction. Many empaths are not weak in perception. They are actually hyper-perceptive. The problem is that they override their own instincts in order to maintain attachment. They sense the red flags early, but empathy convinces them to rationalize what their intuition already understood. They see the dishonesty, but they explain it away. They recognize the imbalance, but they tolerate it because they fear appearing unkind, difficult, or emotionally unavailable. Once they stop abandoning their instincts, their entire emotional framework evolves. And with that evolution comes a new relationship with boundaries. Before, boundaries felt cruel to them. They felt selfish. The empath believed love meant access, constant access, unlimited patience, endless understanding. But eventually they realize something profound. Boundaries are not walls against love. They are filters against disrespect. That realization changes how they move through the world. They stop trying to earn their belonging through self-sacrifice. They stop shrinking themselves to maintain unstable relationships. They become more selective with their energy, their time, their attention. And interestingly, the healthier they become internally, the less attracted they are to emotionally chaotic people, because peace starts feeling more valuable than intensity. This is also the phase where confidence begins to emerge naturally. Not performative confidence, not arrogance, real confidence. The kind that comes from emotional self-trust. The empath no longer needs constant reassurance because they've learned to validate their own perceptions. They stop asking, "Am I overreacting?" Every time someone crosses a line. They stop doubting their instincts simply because another person minimizes their feelings. And that self-trust creates emotional independence. Now, emotionally independent people are often misunderstood because they no longer react from fear of abandonment. They can love deeply without losing themselves. They can walk away without collapsing internally. And to people who rely on emotional control, this kind of person becomes incredibly difficult to manipulate, because the empath has, finally, I learned the difference between compassion and self-erasure. They still care. They still feel deeply. They still understand human pain at a level most people never will. But now their empathy has discernment attached to it. Now they understand that not everyone deserves unrestricted access to their emotional world. And that is the real transformation. Not becoming colder, becoming wiser. Because the moment an empath learns to protect their peace with the same intensity they once protected everyone else's feelings, their entire life begins to change. The final stage is the one that confuses people the most. Because the moment the empath truly walks away emotionally, mentally, internally, something strange begins to happen. The same people who ignored them, manipulated them, underestimated them, or took them for granted suddenly become obsessed with regaining access. And on the surface, that seems contradictory, but psychologically, it makes perfect sense. Human beings are wired to notice loss more intensely than presence. We adapt quickly to consistency. We normalize loyalty. We become blind to emotional availability when we assume it will always be there. And this is exactly why many empaths are undervalued for so long. Their patience becomes expected. Their understanding becomes predictable. Their forgiveness becomes part of the environment until it disappears. Then suddenly the emotional gravity changes. The empath who once responded immediately now becomes distant. The person who once fought to repair the connection no longer argues. The emotional safety net is gone. And for people who built unconscious dependency around the empath's emotional labor, this creates psychological panic, because they were not simply attached to the empath as a person. They were attached to the access to reassurance, access to validation, access to emotional regulation, access to someone who absorbed tension while asking for very little in return. And when that access is removed, People often confuse the discomfort of losing control with love. That's why the reactions become extreme. Some people suddenly become overly affectionate, others become angry. Some attempt guilt. Some create crises to pull the empath back into old emotional roles. Others rewrite history entirely, portraying themselves as the victim. And underneath all of it is the same cycle, their logical reality. They can feel the shift in power because the empath is no longer emotionally negotiating for connection. This is where attachment psychology becomes important. Individuals with insecure attachment patterns often feel safest when they can predict emotional responses. They rely on certain dynamics remaining stable, even unhealthy ones. So when an empath finally detaches, it disrupts the emotional system they had grown dependent on. The empath's calmness becomes disorienting because it reflects something they cannot easily manipulate anymore: emotional self-possession. And this is why people often return right when the empath stops chasing. Not always because they've changed, sometimes because scarcity creates value psychologically. The human brain pays closer attention to what it fears losing. When something becomes emotionally unavailable, perception shifts instantly. What was once ignored suddenly feels important. What was once taken for granted suddenly feels irreplaceable. But here's the danger. Many empaths mistake this renewed attention for genuine transformation. They believe the other person has finally realized their worth. And sometimes that's true. People can become self-aware. But often what returns first is not love, it's discomfort. Discomfort at losing emotional certainty. Discomfort at losing influence. Discomfort at no longer being the center of someone's emotional universe. The empath must learn to recognize the difference, because true change is consistent. It's behavioral. It respects boundaries without resistance. It doesn't appear only after consequences arrive. And once the empath understands this, they stop being seduced by temporary emotional intensity. They begin observing actions instead of promises, patterns instead of apologies, consistency instead of chemistry. That's growth. And perhaps the deepest shift of all is this: the empath no longer measures love by how much pain they can endure. They no longer associate loyalty with self-sacrifice. They realize that constantly rescuing people from the consequences of their behavior only delays accountability. So when they walk away now, they do it differently. Not with hatred, not with revenge, not with the need to prove anything. They walk away with clarity, and clarity is powerful because it ends confusion internally. The empath no longer needs closure. See from people incapable of giving it. They no longer need to win the argument, fix the relationship, or convince others of their value. Their peace stops depending on external understanding. That's when the transformation becomes permanent, because the empath finally realizes something that changes everything. The strongest person in the room is not the one who can control others emotionally, it's the one who no longer needs to.